morning, everyone. Welcome to the East-West Center. My name is Nicholas Hamasevich, and I'm a program manager here at the East-West Center's Washington, D.C. office. We have a great event for you here today on military diplomacy and cultural exchange in the Indo-Pacific. This topic is crucial because the military is a major presence in Asia, a significant factor in the overall strategy and policy in the region, and often the first mover based off of those strategies and policies. So as we look ahead, the landscape of military diplomacy in the Asia Pacific will continue to transform in response to changing geopolitical dynamics and the emerging threats. So this event aims to shed some light on these important issues, provide some new insights, and inspire some actionable solutions. Today's panel was brought together by our East-West Center Adjunct Fellow, Lieutenant Colonel Matthew House. He is an Army Foreign Area Officer with regional specialization in Asia, and Lieutenant Colonel House's notable Asia assignments include serving in Australia, Japan, and Vietnam. He is the Senior Defense Official and Defense Attaché designated to Sri Lanka and the Maldives, with an anticipated start date in the summer of 2025. In support of this event, Lieutenant Colonel House recently is going to have an Asia Pacific bulletin entitled Military Diplomacy in the Indo-Pacific. That will be published soon, and so we will keep you informed on that publication, and we encourage you to read that. The Indo-Pacific is a vital area of interest for global security, and understanding nuances of military diplomacy can lead to more effective policies and partnerships. So finally, I'd like to thank my East-West Center colleagues and team, specifically Zoe Weaver-Lee and our young professionals as well, for helping build us together. The East-West Center promotes better relations and understanding among the people and countries of the United States and Asia and the Pacific through cooperative study, research, and dialogue, and we are definitely doing that here today. Again, thank you for attending, and I'd like to turn it over to Lieutenant Colonel Matthew House. Matt.
All right, good morning, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Hamasevich. As it was alluded to, today we have three esteemed guest speakers who will share their insights on military diplomacy and cultural understanding in the Indo-Pacific. Dr. Roger Kangas and retired Army officer Andre Rivier are here with us in person, while we have retired Brigadier General and Royal Marine Rory Copinger-Symes joining us remotely from the United Kingdom. So with that, I think we should dive in. I want to introduce our first guest speaker, Dr. Roger Kangas. Dr. Kangas is the Academic Dean at the Near East South Asia Center for Security Studies, which is located on Fort McNair in Washington, D.C. Previously, Dr. Kangas served as a professor of Central Asian Studies at the George C. Marshall Center for European Security in Garmisch, Germany. So with that, please join me in welcoming Dr. Kangas.
Hey, thank you, Matt, and thank you all for coming in this morning. I am honored to be part of this discussion on military diplomacy in the Indo-Pacific region, in part because this is really what I've spent the better part of now 25 years working on, which is how does the Defense Department engage with partners and sometimes non-partners in the region. Do we say adversaries? We could discuss that. It's interesting, I come at this as an academic. I've worked with the military again through this whole time, but my own background is that of a academic. Was recently, was at Johns Hopkins University when I got a call saying, we're opening up this regional center, we've just opened up this regional center in Garmisch-Partenkirchen, Germany, called the George C. Marshall Center. The goal of which is to engage with military colleagues from the former Soviet bloc. Basically taking the US, our European allies, but then engaging with our former adversaries, and hopefully finding common ground, hopefully finding a way to talk to each other and to understand each other's approaches, methodologies, and perspectives. I thought I would do this for about a year or two. It's been 25. So I realized this isn't a bad career path, because what I find in this effort is a chance really to present the U.S. perspective, to present U.S. priorities, to try to push for these, at the same time keeping your ears open and listen to what the other side has to say. No surprise that exercise or that undertaking in Garmisch got some attention here in Washington, and other regional centers were quickly set up. The Daniel K. Inouye Asia Pacific Center in Hawaii, which a number of you are probably familiar with. At Fort McNair and here in Washington, we have the William Perry Center, the Africa Center, and then of course my organization, the Near East South Asia Center. 2 years ago, we set up a 6th regional center based in Alaska, the Ted Stevens Center for Arctic Security. I think we have all the regions covered in this. We're all different, but within each, the goal is fairly simple. It's to engage, it's to educate, and to work through outreach. And we'll do this in a number of ways with our foundation programs, where we bring people here to Washington. We engage with our partners in the DC area, but we also work in the region. 2 days ago, I just came back from a program we executed in Singapore, bringing together, it was a Track 1.5 effort, bringing together security experts from India, China, Philippines, Vietnam, Singapore itself, Bangladesh, and other states to look at cross-border challenges and, if you will, confidence-building measures. Later this week, we're going to run a program here in DC for the diplomatic community of many of the Indo-Pacific countries and others on, oh shocking, the US elections, but specifically how the foreign media covers it. And we're looking at Japanese media, some South Asian media, and others. And the goal, again, is to build the ties to connect with others. So, in a long way, this is what a regional center does. So what? Why is this important? Why do we try to foster collaboration and cooperation amongst particularly allies and partners, but again, reach out to countries that may be on less friendly terms with the U.S.? Much of this has to do with really the theme of what you'll hear the 2 presentations later this morning. It's really about understanding the differences amongst the states, if we want to call it cultural understanding, through the vehicle of military diplomacy. This isn't just the realm of academics and of think tanks, the civilian sector, and I would argue in the U.S., the State Department, or USAID. The Department of Defense has a role in this. It's often working with military counterparts in the space, but increasingly with individuals who work in security sectors, MOIs, presidential apparatuses, police forces, intelligence forces, and yes, their own think tanks, academics, and others who work on security matters. Some of this is really to address issues of specific concern in the national security strategy, in our command priorities. So we think in terms, say, of recent challenges such as climate change. Yeah, we'll address those, and we find, of course, that from the region there's a great deal of interest in these issues, and so we'll want to hold seminars and workshops and other meetings to look at this. But then there are also the long-term challenges, and I think this is something all in the room need to be mindful of. The U.S. has a presence in the Indo-Pacific. The U.S. has, I should say, a strong presence. How do we maintain this? Well, we maintain this by continuing to understand the concerns of our allies, of our partners, but also hearing the voices from other countries to gain an understanding, in some ways, of how they see us. It's not always easy. I guess I should say I've had the pleasure, or at least the experience, of working through some highs and some lows in U.S. regional relations. Sometimes, if you want to call it, is it just a public relations problem? No, it's more than that. It's an understanding of where does the U.S. fit in the region, what are the U.S. needs? Are we here in a transactional nature? Are we trying to sell weapon systems? Are we trying to build strategic partnerships on certain material? Or are we looking at a greater engagement? And of course, we hear of conversations of like-minded countries, so the U.S. engaging with India, one democracy to the other. This comes into play. But in all of this, the goal really is to figure out how we can better work with our partners. Now, the importance of these partnerships, and I say this repeatedly, partnerships, allies, etc., it's not just about countering China. I think sometimes that's a narrative that gets reduced, and it's like, that's all we're doing. That's a part. And it's really not about countering China, it's trying to figure out Chinese priorities, our priorities, and where we can work together, and where, if we have to compete. But it's really about the other countries to ensure that they don't have to choose, that they don't have to, or aren't forced into certain relationships or forced into certain dynamics in the region. That we create things such as free and open Indo-Pacific. Others might call this a trite phrase, but in the realm of security cooperation and foreign policy in the region, it does matter. And so in this regard, and just as I sort of close by way of a couple of examples, we look at this, for example, in the area of maritime domain awareness. I'm really pleased, for example, that this is a structure that's really taking off. Yes, particularly among Quad countries, but also among partners of Quad countries. I should say through military diplomacy and through engagement efforts with Quad partners, we better understand their thoughts of what this structure means. Some will say, it's a collective defense alliance. No, it's not. But it is a way where partners can communicate with each other, particularly on technical matters, and looking at, again, maritime domain awareness, looking at monitoring anything from illegal fishing, illegal trafficking, transport, but also basic maritime security of states in the region. This is critical. And so when we look at this importance, we have to focus sometimes on these specific things. And other points, and just kind of to end on, if you will, on a positive note, and why I think military diplomacy is key. Sometimes it just boils down to the people-to-people relations, to the friendships that one makes, but also partnerships that one makes. I'm reminded, this past year I was at a conference in Bahrain, and I'm sitting at dinner table, and the speakers, and in fact it was the president of the Philippines, was our keynote speaker. A wonderful presentation he gave. But I look behind me and there's a gentleman that looks damn familiar. I'm like, okay, who is this person? And he's looking at me like, wait a second. And then we just, eyes locked, we started laughing when we realized he was a student of mine over 20 years ago at the George Marshall Center. He currently works, he's in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Armenia, works Middle East issues. In fact, he's now head of their Middle East Bureau. And so we had a chance to reconnect. And by happenstance, we were doing a program in his country, in Armenia, about 2 months later, and he was instrumental in ensuring that the U.S. Security Cooperation Office got the royal treatment and got what it needed to make this program a success. Happenstance, yes, but it's these connections that matter. Just lastly, we work a lot with the India-Pakistan dynamic, as well as India and other neighbors dynamic, creating back channels for conversations, particularly in light of some of the challenges that have happened, Gulwan and others. Being able to provide a forum for said countries to send messages to each other, to at least talk to each other in a less hostile framework outside of the glare of media is important. And so again, military diplomacy can help this. With that, there's a lot more I could say. Happy to chat further after presentations are done, but very much like to turn it back to our Master of Ceremonies. So, Matt House, back to you. Thank you all very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kangas, for that insightful presentation. It's always a pleasure to gain such valuable perspectives from someone with such a vast array of experiences, specifically dealing with the topic of discussion today. And I specifically, what resonated with me in your comments was towards the end, in that people-to-people ties. That little anecdote, individual relationships matter, is very much at the heart and center of what we do within the DoD, and arguably the U.S. government, whole government approach. So really appreciate your expert perspective. I'd now like to introduce our second guest speaker. We have Brigadier General retired Rory Copinger-Symes. Brig Rory, a Royal Marine with extensive operational planning experience around the globe. Notably, Brig Rory served as an exchange officer at U.S. Indo-Pacific Command, where he was the first British officer to lead U.S. Indo-Pacific Command's security cooperation efforts from 2016 to 2020. He was actually my boss when I served as a security cooperation officer in Australia. So it's always great to reconnect with him here. But now I'd like to, let's all welcome Brigadier General Rory to provide his remarks. Thank you.
Matt, thanks for the intro. Great to see you guys again. I've put my Aloha shirt on just to remind myself at one point I was in Hawaii. Apologies for my screensaver, but I now sell whiskey. So any opportunity to do some marketing, I thought I might as well put it up there. Hope you come to the UK and you can buy it. It doesn't exist in the US yet. Hey, Matt's asked me to cover a number of topics. I'm sort of broadly putting them into 4 areas. Firstly, talk about my role as an exchange officer in the Indo-Pacific headquarters. Then a little bit about security cooperation, because I'm assuming there's a lot of people who know a lot more about it than me, but how it might fit with military diplomacy. Talk a little bit about allies and partners. I have a personal issue there that I'll air. And then finally talk about military agreements. But Dr. Kangas and actually Matt picked up on it. One of the themes I was going to major on, you've already hit, which is great, people to people. This is a people business and fundamental to everything we do. So as an exchange officer, I don't know how many people are military in the audience, how many understand the subtlety of an exchange officer versus a liaison officer, but it's something I have to point out all the time. An exchange officer, the job I did, essentially meant that I was working for the United States. I was paid for and supplied by the United Kingdom, but everything I did in Hawaii and indeed across the whole Indo-Pacific region, I had 23 offices, about 200 people working effectively directly for me. I did that on behalf of the government of the United States. So it's a very strange existence in certain respects, because I'm obviously beholden to my own country, but I'm actually there working on behalf of the US. A liaison officer is completely different. Liaison officer is there representing his country, his military, and liaising with that headquarters. So in Indo-PACOM, we only had the Five Eyes were existing as as exchange officers. So that's Canadians were in first, then the Aussies, then the Kiwis, and I was the last one coming in, certainly at the 1-star level. When I arrived, there were only 3 Brits on the island of Hawaii. So one guy down at PAC Fleet. We had a liaison officer in Indo-PAC headquarters, and then myself coming in. By the time I left, I'd increased that to 6 people, and I was back there in 2023, and that's now about 15 Brits in there. So that reflects something the UK has focused on or accepted quite a few years back, and we can get to that in Q&A. So experience as an exchange officer, firstly, it's a huge privilege, and I can't understate that enough. I had a very, very privileged access in the headquarters, such that I very much worked alongside pretty much all my general officers, but specifically to the 4-star at the top. And it's all about trust. We've already picked up on this theme about people to people. Being an exchange officer is a little bit slowly until you build that mutual trust between yourself and particularly the hierarchy within whichever headquarters. But for me, obviously, it's a big 4-star headquarters, over 800 people in that headquarters. So it does take some time. An exchange officer can't just walk in and assume he or she can achieve what they're being asked to do. It is about building that relationship and mutual trust. There are difficulties. Don't underestimate this, and don't let me give you an impression that it's all rosy and easy to do. Security obviously is a major issue. You can ask me about no fawn and some sagas there. I won't get into it, but Matt knows well my personal bête noires about way certain US militaries operate. But security is a big issue, and you have to accept the fact as an exchange officer you don't have full access to everything, and quite rightly so. The same would happen if an American was working over here in a British headquarters. Mine was non-reciprocal. Most of them are reciprocal. So security is a big issue. Language, interestingly, and I normally start these briefs if I'm in the same room and say and be a bit cheeky and say to you lot, I'm going to speak English. The Americans amongst you sometimes pick up on that, sometimes they don't. But I do speak a slightly different version of English that you call it. We spell things very different. For instance, you're in the East West Centre, you spell it ER, I spell it RE. So language becomes quite an important thing, a meaning. And this is where military diplomacy is important, and sort of brings on to my next bit, which is about military diplomacy and cultural understanding. I found, having been privileged to be in some very senior level discussions about what the US was trying to achieve across the Indo-Pacific, that every now and again, either myself, the Aussie, the Canadian with the 3 1-stars, would every now and again put a hand up and say, have you considered talking to either our nations or even to the nation we're now talking about, without going into specifics? Okay, it is sometimes quite handy to have a foreigner in amongst particularly big American headquarters, where I'm going to be a bit cheeky and say it's groupthink. It's not groupthink, but you know what I mean by that. And it's quite handy because we do think slightly differently. We operate in a different way. And for my instance, I come from a much smaller country, the other side of the globe. Every now and again, I found myself alongside my counterparts from other nations, put our hands up and say, Admiral, what about this? Have we thought about that? And it just adds that element, I think, and I hope that most people in my headquarters appreciated what we were saying, and the reason that we weren't being objective, or sorry, we were being objective. We weren't being objectionable. We were trying to encourage a more broad thinking about what might be there. Now, in my particular role, working security cooperation was very interesting because the first Brit to do it, and also a great bit of trust in Americans letting me go across the region to represent America. Matt mentioned going to Australia. You know, my Aussie counterparts, I happily say, if they're Aussies in the community there, they were a little bit, oh, what's a Brit suddenly appearing over here doing this? We've got the relationship with America in the Indo-Pacific. Your special relationship's over there. So yeah, like I said, I had to build a bit of trust with my Aussie counterparts. So I wasn't waltzing into headquarters down in Australia and saying, right, this is what Indo-Pac said. I had to overcome the first issue, which was, what's a Pommy, as they call us, doing representing the United States? Now, conversely, for instance, where I found I did a lot of work with Japan early on, and I found the Japanese really warmed to a British attitude, for instance, because their nation is about the same size. It's an island nation, small, blah, blah, blah. And actually, we've got a lot of cultural history, bizarrely, royal families and all the rest of it. I found the Japanese really warm to me very early on in my experience. I had no real experience of Japanese culture, dealing with them at all. But I found that actually, as a Brit representing the United States, they warmed to me because I could translate to them in a much more coherent way. That's very unfair, and I don't mean it rudely, but I found they had empathy with the way in which I would approach things. Same with India, funny enough. I'll use that as a good example because, frankly, none of you Americans know how to play cricket. And of course, India loves their cricket. So the first discussion you've got to have is cricket. Now, I'm, again, being a little bit facetious, but I'm just trying to illustrate this point that people-to-people contact is actually quite important, and where an exchange officer can add some value. We can also be a hesitant, if you like, to the foreign nation, because they suddenly think, why is this Brit here representing the United States or the Australian or whatever it happened to be? The reality is, after a while, most people came to the conclusion, how cool is that the Americans are prepared to trust some key allies inside their headquarters and actually work on their behalf to support their effort. So let me move now to the next topic, really, of security cooperation. And apologies if you're all masters of security cooperation. I wasn't until I took over the job. Okay. And Roger, you've used the term security cooperations a couple of times. I want to make the point that actually there are two different versions. There's called security assistance and security cooperation. I didn't know that when I first turned up. And it wasn't until the American team were briefing me that I suddenly realized, hang on, what do you mean by security assistance? Oh, so that's what State Department does. Ah, okay, so that's different to security cooperation. Again, language matters. So security cooperation, understanding the subtlety between what the State Department and security assistance is doing and security cooperation, and I could go into FMF and all sorts of other bits of, I'm not going to bore you with a lecture on security cooperation. How does it work with military diplomacy is what Matt asked me to really talk about. And to my mind, it is fundamental. It is a fundamental piece of military diplomacy. And actually, America is the only nation that really does security cooperation in the fashion that you talk about. The rest of us, we embed it into our defense teams, but obviously we don't have the same clout, the same money, and anything else that the United States does. So it is very, very much part of that military diplomacy piece. My issue with it, to be brutally honest, when I first started, is I didn't feel that security assistance and security cooperation were totally synced up. Now, it wasn't to make sure that they were not necessarily doing the same thing, because they are subtly different in the way they are approached, but making sure there's symbiosis between what we were trying to do in the military lane versus what State Department was doing in security assistance was a little bit of work in order that we needed to do within the headquarters. So again, this was part of me and my effort as a planner from my background, bringing it in, and a different approach, being a Brit, saying, hang on, is this the right way we do things? And actually just trying to tweak and help the team to improve the way in which we did our planning, particularly with our State Department friends. And I have to say, I'd spent a lot of time with State. Every time I flew in to see one of my teams, security cooperation teams, my first call was always with the US ambassador or the charge if he or she wasn't there. So we always had that linkage very close with State Department, and I really appreciated that. But understanding the subtlety of where State is working and where the military piece, because of course Indo-Pacific Command runs its own campaign, has a campaign plan, and those two don't always absolutely align, if I'm brutally honest. They are probably pretty damn close, but they're not always sync completely. So that's security cooperation. I can come back to security cooperation in much more detail if you want to in the Q&A phase. Obviously, there's large facets of it and how we leveraged it to greater effect, whether it be on the foreign military sales side of the house or capacity building side. I'm more than happy to talk through any of that if people are interested. Let me move on to really my third sort of major topic of allies and partners. And Roger, this is where I get my personal bête noire out. Allies, I always have to remind my partners in America, allies and partners is said in one word. It's not. Ally is very different to a partner. And it is sometimes difficult to remind people that allies, you need to deal with allies in a different fashion than you do with partners. And I don't mean to belittle partners, absolutely not. But the United States has got some key allies across the region, and I'm making an assumption you all know who those are in the Indo-Pacific. And it's been, the US policy has been very much hub and spoke across the Indo-Pacific, but that's starting to change from where I certainly was sitting, and I'm seeing since I left there as well, much more to multilateral and millilateral relationships, not just in the military diplomacy lane, but also in the more broader piece. I was pushing pretty hard, and I've actually written a couple of articles since about the lack of a security architecture across the Indo-Pacific. And this is the difficulty I think one has when we look at this huge region and how one tries to pull it together. Obviously, we can go into that in a little bit more in the question and answer phase. But broadly, from my point of view, that we had some key allies and key partners where it was very much I think Roger used the phrase transactional, we tended to be delivering training, education, and hardware to them, whereas other areas, it was very much more in the capacity, so the grant assistance region, which is where we felt the effort had to be. My last point, which actually follows on from this point really, is about military agreements and how they shape the region. And without repeating myself too much, this is a region, or that is a region, because I'm of course the other side of the world now, where military agreements are in flux, in my personal opinion. And it's not, Roger illustrated very nicely, it's not just about deterring one specific nation. It is about maturing a whole concept, if you like. Free and open Indo-Pacific is one of the phrases. Rules-based international order. I could go on. You're good students who know probably much about it. But military agreements do have a fundamental, and sometimes they can actually lead some of the diplomacy, interestingly, because military guys, I hate to say this in front of an audience, so I don't even know how many of you even wear a uniform other than Matt, who's there. Probably most of you aren't. But funny enough, military to military sometimes gets ahead of foreign diplomacy or the State Department, because we have a unifying thing. Wearing a uniform, you tend to understand each other, despite the fact you may have ended up fighting wars with each other over history. But military to military tends to actually be very progressive, if you like, in getting deals done, agreements. We're straight talkers, to be brutally honest. And I don't want my State Department colleagues to run away and feel offended by that statement. That's not the intent. But hopefully you're getting the theme I'm putting out. Military people to military people tend to actually engage very, very quickly and very well. Not always, and I can spin some anecdotes or stories about where it didn't necessarily go so well, but that's probably not the purpose of this session now. So I'm going to draw stumps, as we say in cricket, now, and I look forward to some questions at the end, but just reiterate that point. It's people to people that really matters, and that's the important piece coming out from my point of view. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rory, for that engaging and informative presentation. We greatly appreciate your time and expertise for dialing in all the way from the United Kingdom today. Your comment in that, and I quote, "It is all about trust," is fundamental, in my opinion, in all we do. And it's only amplified when we're talking about dealing with partners and allies that you commented on at length. So in the context of military diplomacy and in our whole of government approach, it really comes down to building that trust with the partner, with the ally, to really enhance that relationship. So I think Rory did a fantastic job summarizing that. Now we come to our third and final guest speaker, Andre Rivier. Andre is a retired Army Foreign Area Officer with extensive experience in Thailand, Laos, and the Pacific Islands. Andre is now working in the business executive realm, and he's at headquarters out of Texas, but he made time in his busy schedule to come with us in person today, so greatly appreciate being here, Andre. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Andre.
Thank you, Matt. All right, you hear me okay? There we go. As Matt said, I'm retired. I run a para-consulting companies right now, basically supporting U.S. companies in Southeast Asia, one business focused and one defense. And it really taught me that there's not much difference between the engagement is engagement, right? Defense engagement, diplomatic engagement, and business engagement. It's the same basic challenge. You have East, especially in Asia, where there's some cultural differences between the way we do business, the way we do operations, to cover. And so I do find really the same thing. As a matter of fact, in my current job, I hire a lot of former FAOs, and they do very good work for us. They do great work for us, actually. Talking about military diplomacy, you mentioned something a minute ago, sir, about the mill-to-mill relationship that we all have. And I think that's a very key thing that we have to kind of cover. I think as a retired military officer, there's a certain bond that officers have and military personnel have in general across the world. And I think you can talk to somebody from, I have more in common often with an Afghan officer than maybe I would with an American sometimes, I feel like. You can kind of talk. You can actually shoot at each other and then have coffee afterwards. This happened before with me. You kind of, your enemies first and friends later. There's that kind of bonding that you have as military personnel around the world. And that's a very powerful thing. And I think that's going to kind of, as you talk about diplomacy and where the military diplomat fits in, understanding that piece is really critical. For diplomacy, and I worked in smaller countries. I wasn't really doing like UK to US relationship. I'm talking about smaller, I focus on the smaller countries, or maybe the ones which are not necessarily established relationships, where it's a bit more on the ground work. I find it very, very key. I really foot stomp, especially for assignments. The most important places for military diplomacy are those, I think, where you have one of two types of government. One where you have a very strong military presence, either a dictatorship, military coup, or a very powerful military, say like Thailand or Bangladesh or Myanmar. And also where there's a royal family. I think there's a real power there. I'll give you the case. I used to be our attaché and security cooperation chief for the Pacific Islands, so I covered 8 countries in the Southwest Pacific. 3 had militaries: Fiji, Tonga, Papua New Guinea. Of the 3, Fiji at that time was a military dictatorship. They had launched a coup. They were coming out of dictatorship to democracy while I was there. And that was a really key engagement for the uniformed officer, because I could really engage with the prime minister, engage with the leadership directly. In fact, by the end, I was delivering demarches on behalf of the State Department, because I had at the end released the unofficial pre-demarche to kind of get the warm up for the complicated things. And you're also, I think I mentioned too, that the modeling of good behavior is critical. There are countries which are not necessarily dictatorships, or not military-led, but the military has maybe an oversized role in politics. Maybe Thailand, for case in point. I know at least one person going to Thailand after this. As an officer or as an American, you have a chance to really model good behavior and really model what civilian control looks like. So maybe I have a tie with the prime minister, because we're both uniformed officers, but now I can go over and bring the ambassador and make her, or him, front and center for my engagement. Really to chance to really show what it looks like. I'd also mention Tonga, royal family at the time, or it is a royal family still. The military, is generally very tied to the royal family, and so engaging Tonga, again, great value. Papua New Guinea, huge country for that portfolio, 7 million people. The military is really its own little discrete organization. Certainly there's value in engaging, but it wasn't the same, value as a military diplomat that you may have in Fiji or Papua New Guinea or Tonga. I guess my point of that would be that as you look at assignments and assigning people, I think the key place to put the top people is those countries where you have that either a royal family or you have a strong military rule. Be really the real benefit of the military diplomat. I'd also mention one last thing. As far as being a military diplomat, engaging militarily, one of the key tasks, which is often overlooked, is engaging back to the U.S. policymaker. We often get great insights. We know what's going on. You're on the ground every day, meeting every day, having coffee, drinks, playing rugby, playing golf, getting a sense for how things work. If you can't relay what you learn to the U.S. policymakers, you really failed at your job. And these policymakers are higher level than you often. You have a planning section, planning for contingency X. And your viewpoint about the availability of base Y in the event in this country that you're in. If you can't relay that effectively, you really haven't done your job. And it's not just the formal means of relaying. I know if you're an attaché, there's a formal means of relaying information. You need to go beyond that, because no one leads those. You really have to go and find a way to engage directly with the policymakers to have an impact. I also want to push on a bit more on the exchange programs. I know Matt asked me to speak about diplomacy and also exchange. I'm a big, big fan of exchange. I was an exchange officer in Thailand. I went to Thai Army Staff College. Our current country director for Thailand, who we hired, used to be an exchange pilot with Thailand. Then he worked at Just Mag Thai as the running security cooperation, and now works for us. Does a phenomenal job. And I think being an exchange officer, more than being an attaché or a security cooperation officer overseas, you just get the insights, that deep-seated insights, what's going on. You can kind of put up a front, right? If you're an attaché or a security cooperation officer, you meet with counterintelligence people, you meet with the procurement officials. You don't meet with real, war fighters, real operators. The folks are going to be generals one day. You're not meeting those people. You're not really getting a sense for how they make decisions. As an exchange officer, you're meeting everybody. You're in there. There's kind of especially in Asia Pacific, there's the kind of the face idea there in most countries. That face kind of backs away after a while. You really get the real true story and understand how people think. And it's not just, how to have coffee or how to have how to do a handshake or how to tip at a restaurant. It's how they would actually do policy. What's going through people's minds at a higher level. When say Thailand looks at the US and looks at China, how are they making that balance? What are the decisions happening? How are they giving orders? How are they executing? These are the things you get insight as being an exchange officer you really don't get as an attaché or embassy-based person where you're kind of kept at arm's length. The other key thing, I think, for exchange, I'd really emphasize, is that you're engaging the 99% of other foreign officers and personnel who don't speak English, who don't go to the US, don't go to IMED courses, don't go to APCSS, all these folks who are, maybe they're just kind of, they're a warfighter, right? They're going to be a general one day, but they're not out there engaging with US people, they don't speak English. And you're building this relationship through linguistic skills, but also just that time together. And after a while, they'll ask you questions. This is a chance to really engage on behalf of the US. Why does the US do X, Y, and Z? They may ask things silly and they may ask things complicated, but this is your chance to really model good behavior. Show what the US is about, not what they see on the news. And it's really a chance to engage these people and make a long-term impact. You look at all the leaders around the world, they have and all of us, right? We've met one person from one country, and you sort of a stereotype in your mind about that country for the rest of your life based on either positive or negative engagement. And I think the exchange program lets you do that. I'd say one last thing, and then I'll stop talking. When it comes to exchange, I do believe DoD is not getting the full benefit. I kind of talk about like driving a Porsche in second gear. You're not quite getting your full speed out of it. And I've discussed this, I know with Matt before, I've discussed when I was in uniform, I discussed this a lot, I really pushed for this. And I'll tell you, go back up, when I was a new officer, when I was getting, or a new FAO, I was getting my master's degree. We had, Admiral Mullen came out to meet with the veterans and military personnel at my school, only 7 of us at the time, and sat down with us and said, hey, what do you guys do? Went around the room, I'm an infantry officer, I'm a pilot, I'm a submarine officer. He goes to me, I'm a training to be a foreign area officer. He stopped, looks at me, he goes, I'm not a big fan of that program. And he goes, let me explain it. So I have all these FAOs out there around the world doing great things, all this money spent on this big program, officers pulled away from their basic branch. And so, I think it's great. My whole life, I'm a 3-star, 2-star, I think it's an awesome program. I'm a 4-star chairman of the Joint Chiefs. The Arab Spring happens. I want to know what's going on in, there's a coup in Egypt. Military is now in charge. So I asked my staff, hey, we've been Egyptians to the US for years, we have Americans going to Egypt for years. Let's get in touch with people. Who knows who? Tell me who went to school with the various leaders over here. And he got no answer. He got no one's, I don't know, we don't track that. We don't know who was with who. All they have is, the attaché in Cairo, who's never been in Egypt before, first time tour, barely speaks Arabic. There's no one out there who really has relationships. And what his point was, and I've pushed this for a while, is we need to track the relationships. We need to know who went to. I went to Thai Staff College with 280 Thai students, 8 other foreigners. We should know who people are, and we should know, and if things come up again, assign people to positions, pull people to TDY, recall to active duty is required to really have those personal engagements. It's all a long-term process, right? In the business world, there's no such thing as a 2 to 3 year tour. I can be your partner forever until I die and you die, I guess. But we can work together. This is the key thing the military doesn't do. And I recognize there's concerns about why we don't do this, but I think this is really critical that we take our relationships, our exchange programs, and do this for, maintain, do this past a 2 to 3 year tour. Keep this relationship alive and keep using people's relationships, the one-to-one personal friendships we develop over the course of a career and beyond to really leverage, not just for policy, but just understand what's going on in these countries. With that, I've spoken for my 10 minutes, so I'll be quiet now and sit down.
Thank you, Andre. Your on-the-ground experience as the tip of the spear in many respects when you were serving in the Pacific Islands, Thailand and Laos, with regard to military diplomacy is fascinating. And I kind of, in a paraphrasing way, I took a note saying that placement and access to have pinpoint effectiveness on behalf of US DoD in delivering US policy narratives with host nation. is good, but what's even better is that feedback loop that you highlighted, Andre, back to the U.S. policymakers. That's what's critical in furthering in either furthering the U.S. relationship with that country or informing U.S. policy officials where we may need to pivot or adjust how we approach that nation. So that's really great insight. And then I took another note here on your the anecdote with Admiral, your experience with Admiral Mullen, who was then the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. It's fascinating to learn that, you know, our most senior U.S. military official at that time, his thoughts on, you know, the Foreign Area Officer Program, and it should give us, hopefully at the time, and if not, if it hasn't, hopefully now, it should give us a pause to reflect on what we need to do, either do a better job of educating in what we do to U.S. senior officials, or change, quite frankly. So fantastic remarks, Andre. Really appreciate you being here today. Now we will move to the Q&A portion, questions and answering. So this is a great opportunity to ask our guest speakers any questions you may have based on, you know, what they commented on today, or what your thoughts might be with regard to military diplomacy and cultural understanding. And if I may open up the first question to kind of get things going. Hopefully we'll get an engaging crowd. And I want to ask Rick Rory, you know, his thoughts, seeing that, you know, he shared his experience at working at the headquarters of United States Indo-Pacific Command in Hawaii, what his thoughts are on joint military exercises and how that might contribute to building trust and interoperability with allies and with partners. So I may ask that first question to Rick Rory, and then hopefully we can have some questions, hands pop up, and we'll bring the mic around for more interaction. Over to you, sir.
Thanks, Matt. And Andre, I totally agree with your statements about the FAO program, mate. I tried to do something on your behalf while I was there as well. But it sort of actually leads into answering about military exercises, because if you look at a country like mine, which does not have quite the serious number of military officers and therefore no FAO program equivalent, how do we achieve our relationship with our allies and partners, particularly across the region? Well, it's through military exercises. And this is fundamental to us. And I'll give you a small anecdote to illustrate how important this is. I was in charge of Royal Marine Young Officer training back in 1999-2000. We had a thing called foot and mouth. You call it hoof and mouth, I think. We closed all our military training areas. So I lifted all our training and we came across the United States, because very kindly the US Marines said we've got some training areas. Anyway, we ran this training 3 months over there. I had the Commandant General of the Royal Marines come over to visit, and I was explaining to him what we'd managed to achieve and how welcoming the United States had been, particularly our Marine counterparts. And I suggested to him, sir, that we needed our young officers to come over and do this every single year as part of their initial training. He said, yes, make it so. We still do that program today. 20 odd years later, we still send our young officers over there to get exposed. And what they do is exercise with their US Marine counterparts in the Infantry Officers School. And they build a relationship, not necessarily quite the way, Andre, you described it, of a long term, but understanding how the United States operates for us is quite important. So long-winded way in a very specific way, Matt, to answer your question, but military exercises across the globe, we are all involved in them. Before one of the invasions, I think the first invasion of Iraq, when a lot of the air cover was coming in from US call signs, guess what? Our, what we call JTACs, were talking on the net. Next minute, call sign so-and-so comes up. They knew each other because they'd already exercised together. So it's a very, very important part as military officers to do these exercises. So you start to build that trust, understand each other's capabilities or lack thereof. Understanding weaknesses is as important as understanding strength. And so military exercise is a fundamental piece to build that trust. and demonstrate your intent across the region as well. So I hope that answers your question, Matt, directly.
Yes, thank you, sir. Do we have questions from the audience? Yes, sir.
Yeah, good morning, everyone. Thank you for a terrific program. As you know, the East-West Center is very much oriented towards developing relationships between Americans and Asians, collaborative study, research, and exchange. And some of you have been involved in the business of doing so at the military level, operational level, exercise level. I have a couple of questions based on your terrific comments this morning. One, do you think U.S. services are expanding their role in the Indo-Pacific sufficient to meet the needs of this theater, given our prioritization of this theater? Are we seeing the kind of pivot towards the Indo-Pacific in terms of personnel, resources, in the FAO community and the FAO work? And secondly, I wanted to ask whether you think this tool set of military engagement, et cetera, how can it best interface with the civilian side of diplomacy and other issues? We talked about a little bit coordinating on country teams and the embassies, et cetera. But where's the lack? For example, Andre, I took your comments very seriously about former Chairman Mullen's comments about the utility of tracking. We all know some of the issues related to tracking officers. But I just wonder whether, since we have this tool set already, what's missing? What do we need to do next in order to take and leverage the things we're already doing, even if we're not expanding? Thanks so much.
You hear me? There we go. It's working. Answer your first question. I think we're doing too much. And I'll be very frank. There's bandwidth issues, right? You add like the SFABs, right? You have the Army's got the Security Force Assistance Brigades. You have 5th SFAB dedicated to Asia Pacific, 6-month deployments, based out of Mongolia, people everywhere. It's too much. They can't absorb the training. They don't want it. It becomes a burden. Same, again, I was the attaché and security cooperation chief for 8 countries. My job has now become 5. They've added new security cooperation personnel. They've added new attaché and SCO in Papua New Guinea. Not necessary. I think we can do less with more, and I think more is too much. We went from, certainly the Pacific Islands, we went from under focus to too much focus now. There's sort of a happy medium. And again, countries don't want to deal with us every day. They want to deal with us as required, and they want to do their own thing. And so I think we tend as the U.S. to put resources in problems. This is probably not the right way to do it for military diplomacy. I'd say more exchange officers, open those programs, but as far as adding more embassy personnel, more training exercises in region, they're just general, putting out U.S. forces in country to go train, not very helpful. I think there's probably a happy medium. To your second question, though, it comes to focus. And so where do you focus things? There are gaps we're not doing right now. And so when it comes to, and again, I'm a little outdated with my knowledge, so things may have been closed already, but one big issue, for example, was police training. We had no good way to do police training. I know we have Wade there, spent time in Vanuatu. Vanuatu has a paramilitary police force, which we do not want to see expanded as a policy goal. But because all of our training and assistance has to be done to the military, we have an extensive program for 333 and for FMF and IMF to engage military personnel, but nothing for the police outside a bit of INCL money. It's changed a little bit right now. We tend to, there's a benefit to countries of building a strong military against U.S. policy goals just to get our money. So I think we need to do better, especially at the police, the kind of whole of government security assistance. The military is a great tool in most countries for external engagement, for maybe engaging on the borders to some degree, but the police must be involved internally. Unless we can put the resources in the police development, as sort of interagency approach in the embassy, where the legal attaché and the defense attaché work side by side in the security cooperation working group, that's been an issue for a long time. I'm not sure it's gotten better, but I think it's a big gap in U.S. policy.
Yeah, and I may ask Dr. Kangas to comment on that second point, Satu, that you mentioned about tracking. I know the NISA Center has a very strong and robust alumni program. Maybe you can comment on that. Sure.
Yeah, maybe sure. Okay. There we go. Okay. Yeah, I mean this, and I should say for the some of the comments raised here, this is a challenge when you have thousands of internationals come through U.S. systems through IMED or other in-country programs, but then the tens of thousands that are involved in programs that are executed, run not just by regional centers, but others, okay, what do we do with these? And you're right, there are different mechanisms to track these. A silver lining in the vetting process that we all have to do is, well, we have data on them. The question is, do we keep up with them? And unfortunately, there is a habit of saying, let's try to get as many people into the pipeline as possible as first-timers, but then do we talk about them in a second, third, fourth space? It becomes episodic. And I would say, yeah, at our center and some of the other centers, we do try to stay in touch. I was reminded of the reference made to the Arab Spring. At that time, we had a number of Egyptian alumni who were giving us real-time feedback, so to speak, from Tahrir Square, saying, hey, this is what's going on, don't believe the media on this or believe this, at least their perspectives. We did channel that on. We did say, okay, hey, here are some data points. Now, whether this is accepted or not, that obviously is up for policymakers. But it is about engaging with them in I should say, re-engaging in other forms. And just the last point, and the issue was raised about language. Often, say for IMED, we need English speakers. For other programs, we do try to broaden it out. So, my center, I work in Russian, we have Arabic, French, we've had to work in, Hebrew, in Pashtun, and other languages. My goal is to work with the partners as needed, regardless of language, getting to this final point raised, which I really appreciated, of policing and other security forces. One of the challenges Defense Department has is we look at MODs, right? Some of our restrictions are we can only work with the military. For so many of our countries, security is, it's a whole of government approach. And by opening our authorities and by allowing us to work with other security forces and intelligence forces, it actually gives us greater contact with those countries. And fortunately, we are able to do that, but it's kind of a push-pull moment, and sometimes it doesn't always work, but back to you.
Yeah, and my own thoughts on that first point, Setu, that you had raised is, paraphrasing, are we emphasizing enough on the Indo-Pacific? And I would argue yes. You look at the national security strategy, the national defense strategy, national military strategy, the Indo-Pacific strategy, all these key strategic documents that the U.S. government has issued. By and large, the verbiage says that the Indo-Pacific is the priority theater for the defense, and that the People's Republic of China is our pacing challenge and our greatest geostrategic competitor in that regard. So, and anecdotally, you look at where the carrier strike groups, which some would argue are our greatest strategic defense assets, where they're positioned globally, you don't see any of those assets leaving the Indo-Pacific theater in support of the other conflicts that we see ongoing in the world today, namely with the war in Ukraine and the situation on the ground in Israel. So, but that's just my opinion on that matter. Well, I would like to open it up for more questions before we run out of time. Yes, sir.
Thank you very much. My name is Patrick Centeno. I'm with the Australia Strategic Policy Institute, ASPI, DC. I would like to ask a question to retired Lieutenant Colonel Rivier. So, as being a foreign area officer, what would you say were the greatest challenges you faced when meeting with other officers abroad, and what did you best do to bridge those gaps? So, for example, in Thailand, did you have to do extensive research on the country or learn the language Thai ahead of time, or did you learn mostly through experience there and build better connections while in the country?
No, great question. I appreciate that. There's a lot to it. I think language is one, but it goes beyond language. It's sort of that cultural understanding. Thailand, case in point, we don't joke the same way. I tend to tell jokes, not in this forum, but when I meet people, I tell jokes. My jokes fall flat in Thailand, and their jokes fall flat on me. It's sort of You guys have been to Thailand, know what I'm talking about. We don't joke the same way, humor is different. And so you have to understand, it takes a while to get used to these things, and then you start getting close to someone, they begin speaking their local slang, and then you're linguistically overwhelmed hearing people speaking in, rapid, Southern Thai, and you're trying to, it's the challenges there. I think that just across the board culturally, there are things to remember that we just do differently. And I've been working in Asia Pacific for about 2 decades now. Again, I'm running a company, 2 companies in the region. There's issues I just can't get around, and they annoy the heck out of me over 20 years. And so case in point would be even emails, right? We're responding. The biggest issue for my company, I'm dealing with Western clients and Asian staff overseas, is an American or a Western client, if I don't know an answer, I'm responding right away to an email saying, hey, I don't know, I'll get back to you. Versus for the most Asian countries, the idea is, hey, I'm not going to answer until I have an answer, so I'll just be quiet. And this is 20 years dealing with this issue, and I can't solve it. And I talk to my staff, and I talk to our clients, and it's just these little frictions add up. So this is one example of many. It's just sort of understanding the language and the deep language and all the frictions, and knowing how to recognize the frictions and how to overcome when possible, and when can't be overcome, just to deal with them. And, some people can get very used to it. I haven't fully. You just have to work around it.
Yeah, thank you. And I may ask Brig Rory to follow up with a comment on that, because when I worked in Australia as a security cooperation officer under his leadership, one thing stuck with me, and it's how we see ourselves versus how others see us. And as a United Kingdom officer, obviously he looks at us a different way than we may see ourselves. And one thing that stood out to me at the time was his comment that FAO's Army Foreign Area Officers, or Joint Forces Foreign Area Officers, his thought was we need to have a better pedigree in negotiations. So that really stuck home with me, and how do we do better at being effective at the negotiation table. So I may ask Brig Rory to expand upon that, sir.
Thanks, Matt. I think I'll sort of go back to the previous question as well, and it's about effectiveness, understanding, and I love America in so many respects, because you just spend lots of money. It's fantastic, but the effectiveness of that money being expended, and this goes back to the previous question, I sometimes question. The negotiation thing was interesting. I was lucky enough to be sent on a 2-week business course in Singapore, care of Uncle Sam, run by the National University of Singapore and Stanford University. And during that course, they exposed us to business negotiation. And I came back after that course saying, oh my goodness, I only wish as a military officer I had been introduced to these concepts way before. And Matt's absolutely right. I wrote a paper and tried to convince various senior people in the American system that FAOs needed to be taught these skills of negotiation, because there's a lot that business does right in negotiating its various deals. And these little techniques that I forget whether it was Stanford or NUS who were teaching us. But anyway, I came back very sort of seized by this concept that negotiation is a real skill. And Andre sort of alluded to it, because everybody assumes that somebody who's chosen to become a FAO is therefore going to understand all of those nuance and subtlety. We all get annoyed by each other in our own cultures, let alone go cross-cultural boundaries. Now, it's bizarre because Australia being the other side of the globe, I've got probably more cultural closeness with my Aussie counterpart than I do with my American counterpart, who's just across the pond. So there's a small example, and I think it was an APSI comment question there anyway. So there are always these little nuances of how you learn to deal with people when you meet them. And I don't pretend to be an expert. I personally struggle to speak English anyway, so I'm not even a linguist of any sort. Luckily, I'm married to one who speaks every language that she seems to pick up on. So Matt, I think I've sort of asked the question, but I've also linked it back to the previous one there.
Question?
Thank you so much, gentlemen. Can you hear me? Yeah, Nick Richards, Army Foreign Area Officer with a focus in the Indo-Pacific. My question is for the panel as a whole. My question is about the challenges and opportunities in the conduct of security cooperation in partner nations that are struggling with democracy. Maybe challenges with human rights, we've seen that we've got, despite a strategic need to maintain influence in a certain country, we've got a diplomatic requirement to contract some of that cooperation based on lady vetting or restrictions under the Export Control Act for arms. So what do you see as opportunities to throttle some areas of cooperation while contracting those that we have to? Thank you.
Now, this is an excellent question, and I would say for anyone engaging, I would almost say throughout the world, this is a challenge. The U.S. at times emphasizes, if you want to call it, the democracy, human rights topic. Other times it's less important, and I don't mean saying it's irrelevant, but when we look at shared security concerns, if there's a crisis, we tend to put it in a different perspective. And I think, in just my personal opinion, you can do both. And just kind of full disclosure, as you know, in academia and before I worked for the Defense Department, I wrote for Freedom House, and I worked on human rights issues in other countries, particularly many of the countries with whom I still work. And so I see that side of the issue. But just very quickly, the challenge is, with respect to security, ultimately, what's the objective? What's the goal? Why is the U.S. engaging with country X? And sometimes we have to look at the relationship long-term and understand that we're dealing with a partner that may not have some of the same values and same approaches or systems that we have. But we need that security assistance. We have to work with it. Doesn't mean we have to ignore human rights, democracy. In fact, in private conversation, in meetings, we can bring it up. And in fact, I would say that is a good space to do it. The military is poised in some ways better than some of our State Department colleagues to do this, because there is that shared language, common approach, and military officers, military professionals can speak to each other, I think, in a very candid, comfortable way. But the other thing is, when we bring it up, and I think this sometimes can be a fault in the US, is we love to name and shame. We love to critique a country publicly, and in some of our countries, that sense of public embarrassment, again, if we think of cultural differences, this is the absolute wrong way to do it. The response of late has often been, okay, the US criticizes us, we will work with other partners, we're good with that. And we end up now losing a potential partner, a potential, I wouldn't say ally, but a potential partner in the space. And so it's a question we can bring up, it's a question we should bring up, but sometimes based on the challenges that we may commonly face, we have to put it in a broader context. It's a long-term process. And we see this in all of our countries. By the way, working security cooperation with Ukraine 20 years ago, I will tell you that the democracy challenge and the corruption challenge was one we saw then. We've seen improvements, and we can say with all honesty in 2024, here's a country that does have greater shared values, and I know in South Asia, Southeast Asia, we can give similar examples.
I have one quick point to that too. We've had a talk before this. I do a lot of work in Bangladesh right now with one of the big operations. Obviously, there's been some in the news. They've had issues with the last election. My company, we get paid, we make defense sales, so I like to see them go through. That being said, human rights is important, and we can do both. To your point, I'd say how we punish. There's sort of two aspects. First of all, is what we do. I would say, in my opinion, the most important thing is assured supply chain. Once you sell equipment, you need to have that assured supply chain for the lifetime of the equipment. This is a big struggle for why countries don't buy American equipment. They're afraid of losing out on spare parts for aircraft and so forth. So I would say that's one thing to leave alone. I think there are places you can sanction new aircraft sales, F-35 versus F-16 and try. That's a place to step in and direct behavior. Once equipment's been sold, you have to do supply chain. You have to keep engaging with IMET, APCSS, all these things, not human rights abusers per se, but if they're in the wrong unit, that's not really a reason not to send them to the U.S. There's smart sanctions is important. The last thing I'd say about humility, and the U.S. has got problems too, right? And I think the key is not to be hypocritical about it. And I'll tell you an anecdote. I'm in Fiji right before the elections. We've been at that point of military dictatorship for about a decade. We have a big plan to get them out of, start IMET again, start assistance, help build their One of their training bases is the peacekeeping center for the U.S. forces to use, which has all come to fruition now. But right before the election, the military had one job: stay in the barracks, don't do anything. Go play rugby, drink beer off the streets. They had a guy out there throwing rocks, drinking beer right before the elections. The military rounded him up, beat him up, and put him back in the streets again. So, of course, we get the note from D.C. It got noticed by the human rights folks there to go figure out what went on. So I went to go see the military. I saw the chief of operations, and I said, "Hey, sir, you know, what the F word were you thinking? Like, you're messing things up right now." And he goes, Andre, you don't understand. He was out there causing problems, right? Yeah, of course. In the U.S., what would you do? We'd probably arrest him, put him in jail. Okay, he's in jail, then what happens? Who takes care of his family? Who provides for his wife? We arrested him on a Friday night. We queued him up on Saturday and released him in time for church on Sunday. I think that's better than your system of putting people in prison for years. And I said, "Hey, that's a pretty darn good point, sir." And they wrote it up. And I did. And in fact, State Department said, "Hey, that's cool." I got a positive response to that cable. So just got to be, I think, open-minded about our flaws. And as you engage, I think it's key to identify our own flaws as part of the conversation. And what do we do better? What are the things that are sort of the red lines? And what are things we can maybe let pass?
Yeah, and if I might give Rick Rory a chance to provide a comment on that as well, sir.
Well, need to say that the previous two have stolen most of my sandwiches, as we say, and covered it very well. But a great question. I will compliment the chap who's just asked that. And it's about strategic imperative in my language. Is you've got to look across the region and decide, okay, where are the imperatives for, in your instance, it's a US foreign policy / military diplomacy, and therefore apply the tools. And the question, I think the bit that you guys haven't picked up on was, where are the opportunities in this? And I can think of several of my failures in countries where we had very limited access, if you like, or mainly through human rights issues and stuff. And therefore it's pretty simple, right? What are the tools available to you? And it's maybe HADR programs. It might be all the soft stuff that really doesn't naturally sit necessarily in a military lane that we always think about. The United States actually has lots of programs, and it may be State Department led. So what? Doesn't matter. And the point that both the previous speakers have said is it's all about maintaining that access so that we can subtly make the point, hey, you know, well, the way you do things is probably not the best way to do things, you know, and that's about our own principles. But again, we need to be humble in the way we approach it and make sure that we're not lecturing them. So hopefully I've sort of answered your opportunity question, or tried to a little bit there.
Yeah. Thank you, gentlemen, for those comments. We're going to wrap up right now. We're about time. So I wanted to thank everyone for their insightful questions and to our speakers for their thoughtful responses. Before we conclude, I'd like to extend our deepest gratitude to Dr. Kangas, Brigadier General Rory, and Andre Rivier for sharing their knowledge with us today. We hope, obviously I hope, and the center hopes that the audience got a lot out of this. I believe it's recorded, and we'll be publishing it within the week, I imagine. And hopefully you leave here with some new ideas on how to, kick the can in a positive direction moving forward in the framing of military diplomacy and cultural understanding. So again, thank you for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you at our next seminar. Have a great day.